Good evening, everybody. We've had a very strange electoral year. It remains to be seen what the ugliness, excuse me? Oh. It remains to be seen what the ugliness of this year's political rhetoric will do to the presidency in general and to future elections. However, one thing seems certain. Out of this 2016 election, a clear winner has emerged. I don't mean the Democrats. I don't mean the Republicans. I mean the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party. A recent BBC report reminds us that for years, the Chinese have been telling us that our democracy is in fact rigged by and for a few elite. Now, one of the presidential candidates has said the same thing. For years, we have been complaining that the Chinese throw their political enemies into prison. Now, our presidential incumbent has said that if he takes office, he will throw crooked Hillary into jail. The Chinese are having a field day with all this. They feel that American politics has been distilled essentially down to entertainment value and not much else. They suggest that the American voter is more interested in selfies and insults than in substantial political issues. And they also think that the American voter has lost sight of the big picture, that instead of voting for the nation's long-term interests, people vote for individual, immediate self-interest. So, with this recent election, it seems the ideological gap between China and the US is continuing to grow. And in fact, most contemporary Chinese don't feel that democracy is necessarily a good system. What they point to is their own incredible rise out of poverty over the past 30 years, and they suggest, probably correctly, that if China were a democracy, it would not be able, in fact, to have doubled its standard of living every 10 years for the past 30 years. A 2013 Pew Global Attitude Survey reported that when Chinese were asked how happy they were with their government, 85% responded very happy, and when Americans were asked the same question, only 31% answered in the affirmative. So everybody thinks their own system is the best. But what's even more striking is that both sides also feel that their own system is the morally better system as well, not just the more efficient system. In 2013, the New York Times published an article that consisted of a document leaked from the CCP's inner corridors. It was a document simply called Document Number 9, and in it, the party leaders listed the 7 great evils that they thought plagued the West. This document is very startling to us. Among the 7 great evils, we have freedom of speech, human rights, the right to political participation. How can this be? Is this document a joke? Now, I grant you that one can be very cynical about this document, and one can see it as a move by the party leaders to keep Western ideas out of China. And certainly, there are all sorts of problems with corruption in China and with the new cult of the person at the head and so forth. But I submit to you that there's something else behind this document, that there's a part of it that reflects thousands of years of Chinese thought, and that part of the document is not at all cynical, it's actually very heartfelt. In other words, I'm suggesting that today's political rhetoric, both in the US and in China, is actually influenced by centuries and centuries of thought, not just the past 50 or 100 years of political debate. Here's an example of what I mean. In 1899, the word guomin was coined in China. This is the Chinese word for citizen, person of a nation. It was not coined until 1899, a concept that we've all lived with and that we consider a norm among human beings. The man who coined this word, Liang Qichao, was a journalist and a scholar who had read widely in Western literature and who was keen for political reform in China. Unfortunately, when he published his work in 1899, China was still under the dynastic system, and the Emperor Dowager was not particularly keen on having Western ideas proliferating her dynastic system. So Liang Qichao had to flee for his life off to Japan. When the Qing dynasty finally fell in 1911, Liang Qichao came back, and at that point was able to talk more openly about his ideas. But they didn't really take. China went through several decades of civil war, and that ended in 1949, of course, with Mao Zedong taking power. And inasmuch as he was effectively the main or sole ruler of China at this point, there are some similarities between the Communist Party and the old dynastic system. Now, contrast the history of the West. For us, the idea of citizen is familiar all the way back to ancient Athens, a city-state in which every male citizen over the age of 18 had the right to vote, to participate in debate in the assembly, and even the right to hold offices, because most of the offices at Athens were distributed not by vote, but by lot, so that even the most untalented person would have a good chance at holding political office someday. Not all the ancient Greeks thought this was such a great idea. Thucydides and Plato in particular thought that Athenian democracy would be a disastrous way of running a state. But even they agreed that while they didn't like direct democracy, still the most important thing any male human being could do was participate in his own political system. This gave meaning to life. This was the most important ideal. You're probably all familiar with Aristotle's famous quotation, "Man is a political animal." It doesn't mean that men were born to kiss babies and run for office. It means that the human being, qua human being, only finds fulfillment of all his potential in being an active citizen in a city-state. If you don't participate in politics, if you don't seize the rights of a citizen, you are not a human being. You are a god or a beast. Or in his other formulation, you are a bird who flies alone. On the Chinese side, on the other hand, what we have thousands of years of is the dynastic system. And obviously, in a dynastic system, your average person can't decide to participate in politics unless he or she was born into the ruling family. There was a court of elites who studied Confucian texts. There was the emperor and his family, but there were no mechanisms in place for political participation. As such, the need for a concept like citizen simply wasn't there. In fact, the Chinese thinkers of this era, like Confucius and Mencius, avoid talking about politics or the rights of the citizen in their discussions of what human beings should do. Instead of focusing on the rights of the citizen, what they focus on instead is the duty of the good human being. What makes a human being moral? And the answer to that question was certainly not participating in the emperor's court. It was showing respect and love to your parents and to the emperor, revering your ancestors, and most of all, knowing your place in the hierarchy. Confucius felt that social harmony depended upon people knowing their place in the hierarchy, and that as soon as people tried busting out of their natural position, the state itself would be in danger of collapse. A very different view of what is morally good than in the West. These thoughts and influences have continued down to the present day in China, just as ours too have continued down to our day. So, for example, just last year, a museum of filial piety opened in Sichuan, and people were encouraged to go to experience what it really meant to properly revere your parents and your ancestors. Some Chinese companies even insist that their employees donate a portion of their salary to their parents every month. This ideology is well and strongly in place. On our side, we continue to focus on the rights of the citizen. We want rights. We believe we have the right to be happy, the right to be rich, the right to have our dissatisfactions addressed. We so much believe in these rights that it may be that Donald Trump came to power on the back of such beliefs. We've certainly traveled a long way from the much more restricted views of our own founding fathers, some of whom, at least, were very skeptical about democracy and everybody having rights. You probably also know this famous quotation from James Madison in Federalist Papers number 10. I'll just read the first part. "Democracies have ever been spectacles of turbulence and contention, and have in general been as short in their lives as they have been violent in their deaths." That could be Xi Jinping saying that right now. So, what do I want us to take away from this extremely brief look at the past and present of China and the US? I want us to think about how it's very difficult to step out of the shadow of our own history of thought and to look at it from the outside. It's very difficult to be what one might say is somebody who recognizes their own context and can see it as not necessarily natural. As we on our side are talking about rights, on the other side, the Chinese side, it seems that some of the old Confucian values are back with a vengeance. We have nationalism on the rise under Xi Jinping, a way of thinking that really privileges the good of the entire nation over the right of the individual. People come together to support activity in the South China Sea or to criticize Taiwan. People are happy to get wealthier, but they're not particularly interested right now, at any rate, in exercising those rights. They feel they have bigger fish to fry. So speaking of fish, my point is that we should try to see the water that we swim in instead of taking it for granted, or worse still, not seeing it at all. It's not clear whether democracy is a universal aspiration or merely a culturally rooted practice. But I think that as soon as we learn to ask that question, we are in a different place. We're in a place where we can relate more closely and with greater intelligence to our political other. Thank you.